the gospel about marriage, but marriage in the context of life after death, falls well on the feast of St Norbert. Why? He was one of the giants that Providence raised up in the cleaning up operation which is referred to as the Gregorian Reform. Pope Gregory, that's Hildebrand, the Benedictine who became a pope, was keen on enforcing as far as possible for the whole Western Bloc exactly what was required of a priest. And one of the means of making that happen was to encourage greatly priests to live together. And therefore this powerful movement that St Norbert was involved in, Canons Regula, was a means that Divine Providence made use of massively at the time. It meant that living together kept them chaste and also kept them spiritually poor, detached, and made them hugely available for what they were there for. It also made them available as angels of the earth to spend much time praising God. Now remember, we are here in the Middle Ages, way before the cracking of that mould in the time of the Council of Trent. We are still functioning in the ambit of essentially the monastic structure. Therefore, when St Norbert, after his conversion, which was quite dramatic, took seriously the fact that he was already in minor orders, he was a subdeacon, and asked actually for ordination to the diaconate and the priesthood at the same time, and was granted it, and it's called the Norbertine privilege, still theoretically available. Actually our prior had it. He was ordained very quickly, about 3 weeks I think between the two. When Norbert had his conversion, he took on board the fact that he was invested with the priesthood and that this was the central point of all reform. And therefore he was able to use the fact that he was gifted as a great preacher and that he had a massive influence over those that he preached to in Germany and France, and was therefore acquiring a huge number of recruits and also a large number of holy virgins, which became then the Canonesses Regula. But these men were a huge tool for reform, preaching. But then what? He decided to keep what was known already in Europe with regard to the structure. He was charismatic himself, known as a fantastic preacher, and he was not the one who codified the charism. It was his successor as the first abbot of Prémontré, Blessed Hugues de Fos, who wrote down really that spirit and codified it. And it took, because of his spirit, a very monastic form, essentially a Cistercian form, including the white habit, and the divine office monastically celebrated with great solemnity by the brethren in choir. St Bernard and St Norbert knew each other. They were contemporary, and there was an influence of one on the other. It was actually thought at the time that Norbert would be better known in history than Bernard because of his huge effect in preaching. But actually the contrary turned out to be the case, because Bernard wrote a lot more, and that's actually still having an effect every time he's read, for instance, in church at midnight or in the office of readings. But this question of brethren living together did not, therefore, go as far as it was going to go in the subsequent cracking of the mould by the mendicants. What, therefore, we have, when Norbert dies, he dies an archbishop in the eastern part of Europe, Magdeburg, is a situation where the brethren maintain essentially the structure of abbot, prior, novice master, and stability. That's a big one to maintain. And therefore, there is a very similar atmosphere between a Norbertine house and a Benedictine one or a Cistercian one. With his charism to preach and also his influence as a bishop, an archbishop, the houses in the east become more canonical, whereas those in the west, closer to France, remain very monastic. Now, I'll make a jump because it's important to realize what actually happens. It's a safe model which has a huge healing effect on the area, because even to this day, if you have an abbey of that ilk, what tends to happen is the whole area is influenced by it. In Austria they have the model of the satellites. The abbot will farm out his canons, his priests in the area, and they will therefore have all the parishes in the area. It's massive influence for good. With the subsequent wave of reform, a kind of evangelical reform, as it were, before the time, that's cracked. It's broken open by St Francis. Now, Norbert is dead already in 1134. St Francis is coming not that long afterwards, but it's the Norbertines who make this next step possible, because they have already taken on board the active life anchored in contemplation and the singing of the office, which is maintained, and the solemn liturgy hugely ornate and glorious. We in our monastery had every morning High Mass with incense and fully chanted in Latin every day, and it was powerful. So it's based in contemplation, and the office was very dignified and chanted with great care every day, the whole of it. Now, St Francis cracked that. The big one to go was stability, and with it therefore enclosure in one place. He had them living a spirit essentially which was free, which suited very well the Italian temperament, and that is still the case to this day. And that availability had a massive effect at that period on the church wherever it went, and it grew very quickly, the Franciscan movement, but they did not carry on the tradition of the solemn celebration of the liturgy. Now that was therefore something that would make them more available again. His spirit was this, simplicity, and therefore if the brethren were together, they would have the office, but it wouldn't be celebrated in the same solemn way as it would be in a classic monastery. That would make a difference as regards availability for the work that the Lord would entrust them with. Then in parallel we have the other massive mendicant movement based on actually the rule of St Augustine, as was that of Norbert. They took on the rule of St Augustine, which is that of the Canons Regular. Augustine himself was living in community with his brethren, even as a bishop, but available for the work of the people of God. But the Dominicans kept that and kept more of the structure which they had already seen around. Dominic himself had been a canon of Osma in his younger days, and it was a movement again of availability. He saw the importance of preaching, initially because of the Albigensian heresy in the south of France, but then of course it hit hard in the academic world, and to this day they're in front line with regard to academic combat in all the great centres of learning. Here we have them nearby, in Dublin, we have them in Oxford, we have them in Rome, actually where I studied, where John Paul II has studied as well, great centre there, the Angelicum named after Thomas Aquinas. So they were engaged in there, but they kept, and they still have that, the well-celebrated sung office, which is fairly monastic in style. They do it quite well. If you go to Tala and listen to them, or St Saviour's there in Dublin, it's very beautiful. Young men, and they mean business, and they're attracting. So that has a fascination for any young man. But they were able to maintain, therefore, the best of what was received, but to crack the mold again with regard to stability and enclosure, which gave them huge availability. Then, and only in a third stage, do we have what happened at the Council of Trent, when it was completely exploded with the new type of orders, like the Jesuits, where, strangely enough, they had a maximum of study for many years and ordained to the major orders, that is subdiaconate onwards, as late as possible, giving them availability for a huge amount of study, all those years of formation. And then, of course, a completely interiorized spirit, because the Jesuits classically have a very severe novitiate in which they work on the will. For 2 years they work on the will in such a way that that takes the place of any exterior structure, because they have to go without a structure, like torpedoes into the sea. That is, hit hard with complete availability, obedience. They have no will. That's essentially how it works, classically. But the structure will be based on a very well-formed life of prayer. Would have been traditionally an hour of mental prayer every day, and they had a whole method of doing so in which all the faculties were engaged, including the imagination and of course the will. That's then something that will give the Church an army able to combat the forces of Protestantism, and also to follow the huge expansion through the conquistadores going to the New World and taking on often, after they've gone there, these powerful missionaries to bring the gospel afterwards, and then that formed essentially what we have in Latin America. It's one going after the other. And at the same time, following the Jesuits, there came in a whole band of very new congregations based on people sharing the priesthood, but without the structure and the solemn singing of the office. The Dominicans always kept the celebration together, the Jesuits didn't. It's individual, essentially. All that to say that this is what we see, the Lord raising up at the right time the right people for the work. And what about our time? Well, it's not ceased entirely. I finish with this, but it's worth taking an allusion to, because I remember being very impressed with what I was finding in France in the years following the Second Vatican Council. There were a lot of very powerful movements and even congregations growing like mushrooms in the wake of renewal. And they were taking on the best of the new and the best of the old, often very charismatic and very beautiful liturgies, but very orthodox, and everything being renewed, but quite demanding. Fasting, vigils, adoration for hours, and this beautiful liturgy. So the Lord is never short of means, and perhaps when a young person now asks where he should go, he needs to look around very carefully before deciding. Because sometimes if one goes, unfortunately, to something which has not had vocations for a long time, partly because the charism of the founder has been lost sight of, then there's not much sometimes to offer as regards specificity, whereas quite often fresh foundations know exactly what they want and can draw. The safest in a way is those old ones which have had the capacity to renew themselves and keep the essence of it, and there are quite a few of those still around, e.g. in Ireland, Dominicans. But there are new ones coming, e.g. the Missionaries of the Blessed Sacrament, which are very orthodox and doing what we're doing on this very day as we honour St Norbert, offering Holy Mass in reparation. They draw a lot, and even actually recuperate some who have left seminaries. Why? Because they're not playing around. They know exactly what they want, and the Lord, when he finds a place, a community where he's going to receive the maximum of honour, is not short in sending them very generous vocations. And so the pattern then emerges that young people draw young people, and they console each other and maintain each other, because there's nothing worse than being alone in a novitiate or even in a seminary where everyone else has a different message.